from Oklahoma.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that quorum call in progress be initiated.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I just came back just a week ago from visiting our troops stationed all around the world. We were in all the commands, AFRICOM, EUCOM, CENTCOM, and kind of talking about the threats in all these regions. At a time when I hear colleagues across the aisle and political pundits ask the question, why do we have troops in various places like Africa? It's important to remember the strategic importance of Africa. I remember 10 years ago, we didn't have a command for Africa. It was a part of three commands. You had Pacific Command, the Central Command, and European Command. Now we have AFRICOM, so its own command, and it seemed a little unreasonable that we were treating Africa as somewhat of a stepchild when that's the brewing ground that is out there for a lot of the things that are happening in terms of the terrorism. So despite our military's reach and influence, our nation's shrinking defense budget has put AFRICOM at risk during a time when the commanders are saying that we face the most dangerous world that we've ever faced. And we have. I mean, right now we are, I've often said I look wistfully back at the days of the Cold War when we had two superpowers and they were predictable. We knew what they had. They knew what we had. Mutual assured destruction meant something. It doesn't mean anything anymore. So you have people from all over the world are putting together equipment that we never dreamed that they would have. Now, we've just gone through 8 years of another administration. I don't say this critically, but I can, of him, one thing about President Obama was he is a committed, sincere liberal, and liberals generally are just, they don't pay a lot of attention to the military. So now we find ourselves in a situation where we really are hurting. And we know that a lot of people think that they assume that we don't have any problems militarily. Sometimes I remind people that back in, up until about 1962, we spent more than half, 52% in 1962, of all of our revenues on defending America. And what is it today? It's 15%. When I tell people that, they're in shock. We're in a situation that we're in. We have terrorist groups in Africa, like ISIS, Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, and they're all growing in capability and have expanded their areas throughout Africa. This year, we've seen horrific events occurring at the hands of these extremists. On October the 14th, a truck bombing killed 300 people in Somalia's capital. In Niger, it just happened that we had 4 of our U.S. soldiers were killed in action on October the 4th by an ISIS group. So we know that we have really serious problems. And I think it's a great disservice for people to say, well, we must have known that we had the threat that was out there in Niger, when in fact we didn't know. And they even compare it sometimes with Benghazi. I can remember Benghazi. I was there at the time. I remember Chris Stevens. Chris Stevens was the ambassador that went there. He was in my office right before he left, talking about the threats that were there, talking about the Taliban, this training there. We're talking about organized terrorist activity. And I have to remind people that the persons who are responsible for advising the Secretary of State, who at that time was Hillary Clinton, and the President, who was President Obama at that time, they are the DNI, the Defense, that was James Clapper at that time, the Secretary of Defense, and the Secretary or the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. All of them, when the Benghazi thing happened, the annex was blown up, they all said at that time and advised us and the President and the Secretary of State that they were forewarned by more than a month that on the anniversary of 9/11, things would blow up and it was going to be an organized attack. To suggest, when we have no evidence, right now there's an investigation going on to determine whether or not there's any way that we could have anticipated that in Niger that this would be happening. And so far, that hasn't come up. So Despite the best of intentions, many of our partners in the region lack the capacity and the effectiveness to adequately defend themselves. And when people say, what do we have to gain there? This is exactly the same situation that we saw in Afghanistan prior to the war there, that the terrorists have to have a safe harbor to train in, and that was what was happening. So during my travel, I had the opportunity to meet Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and I have to say this, that about him, I've never seen him so ecstatic because he was, a lot of us looked back at what they were trying to do during the Obama administration, and it was disheartening to think that that they put together this Iran deal that our Secretary of State at that time, John Kerry, talked about how great it was and all these concessions that were made, when in fact that wasn't the case. And nonetheless, when our president came out and said that he was not going to recertify the Iran deal, that was kind of neat, because people don't realize that it takes every 30 days a recertification by the president in order to keep the Iran deal together. Well, he has not done that, and I happened to be in shortly after that talking to Prime Minister Netanyahu, and it was an incredible relief to him that we are going to be looking at this thing, because still today, I think we all understand that Iran is that's the one that is financing terrorism all around the world. So anyway, we discussed these shortcomings. I look forward to working with my colleagues on this in the future, and that Iran does not become a nuclear nation, not now or never. Now, what's perhaps the most encouraging is the message that this approach sends to the rest of the world, specifically North Korea. President Trump's approach shows me, and more importantly, shows Kim Jong-un, that an American first foreign policy means that we refuse to take a single-minded approach to global threats. I recall the change that's taken place 8 years ago when our new president, President Obama, started his appeasing tour by going over, talking about how America hasn't been doing the right thing, and now all of a sudden we really changed that around. And that's what is taking place now. But at that time, we didn't have the threats that are out there today. You know, we look at North Korea, and here's North Korea that's run by a questionable person, totally unpredictable, according to our own military leaders. And he is rapidly getting the capability, not just of an ICBM. He's already proven he has an ICBM, but could range not just Alaska and some of those areas, but the entire continental United States. On July 4th, he launched his first successful ICBM. Now, if that were fired on a standard trajectory, that missile could have reached Alaska. And some experts think it could have reached even further into continental United States. Well, in light of that test, the Defense Intelligence Agency updated their assessment of the timeline by which North Korea would have the capability of hitting an American city. Instead of being 2 years out and 3 years out, it's now down to 1 year out. And some people say they've got it right now. So we have that threat that's out there, the greatest threat, in my opinion, that we are facing now or that we have ever faced. So following this, on September 3rd, North Korea tested what is believed to be a hydrogen bomb. That would be 7 times the power of what was dropped on Hiroshima. And even if delivered by a relatively inaccurate ICBM, would be horrible damage that it could impose on our continent. So it's important to remember all this power is being wielded by an erratic despot, Kim Jong-un. North Korea officials have stated that they are not interested in diplomacy until they have an ICBM capable of reaching the east coast of the United States. Well, what does that tell you? It tells you that they're on their way. And this stresses the need for the United States to enhance and accelerate our ballistic missile defense systems and to continue to put pressure on North Korea through every other means we can, diplomatic and otherwise. My recent travels enforced again what I have been saying for some time, and that is this is the most dangerous we've had, certainly in my lifetime. But we have an opportunity to counter that threat right now. We're in the midst of our NDAA. One thing about the National Defense Authorization Act is that this act it's going to pass. It's passed for 55 consecutive years, so we know it's going to pass now. But we need to go ahead and get it done. It's important because of the primary constitutional responsibility that we have is to provide for the common defense of our great nation. We have serious readiness issues that are going to have to be addressed, and they are being addressed in this bill. The chairman of the Readiness Committee, that's me, we have fought hard to ensure that this year's NDAA takes care of these shortfalls that we have had. Our forces are smaller now than in the days of the Hollow Force. We actually had a Readiness Committee hearing, and we had the vice chiefs of all of the services, and they came in and they said, right now we are in the same situation we were when we had the Hollow Force following the Carter administration in the 1970s. Well, speaking in January to the Army Readiness Committee, and this is just January of this year, the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army, that's Daniel Allen, General Allen, he said, what it comes down to, we're going to be too late. Our soldiers will arrive too late. Our soldiers will require too much time to close the manning, the training, and the equipment gap. The end result is excessive casualties to civilians and to our forces. We're talking about deaths. That's what's at stake right here. Just last week, I met with Secretary of the Air Force, Heather Wilson, to discuss aviation readiness. You know, right now we've got 1,500 pilots short. 1,300 of those are fighter pilots. Only 50% of the Air Force's squadrons are actually trained and ready to conduct all their assigned missions. A third of our brigades on the ground, our ground brigades, don't work. They're not ready for combat. A fourth of our aviation brigades, the same thing. Right now, as we know, the Marines use the F-18. Of our fleet of F-18s, 62% of them don't work. They don't have the parts for combat. So we have this situation that is going to have to be direct. And this year's bill will increase the troop levels. We'll do what's necessary to correct these problems. So we need to get moving on that. And I think people who are aware of the threat that we're under need to know that help is, in fact, on its way. And by the way, one of my concerns in this bill, and there are a lot of people who are interested in the BRAC process, we do prohibit a base realignment and closing commission to take place for another year. And the reason for that is not that there may be excess right now capacity or excess resources out there, but when we're in a rebuilding mode, we would rather be able to use those resources that aren't used now than build new ones. So. And one thing that's true about a BRAC round, it always loses money the first 3 years, and right now we can't afford to lose any of the money that goes to defending America. So anyway, of the additional funding, there's going to be an $8.5 billion for the missile defense that has been suffering, and we're going to really be doing some good things. So as we continue the conference process, which started today, we had our first conference meeting today, we need to ensure we focus on where we are. So again, I'll just repeat that the threat is there. We understand that. We know what's happening in Africa. And by the way, the number of people that we have, troops that we have over there, you got to quit using this thing about 6,000. It's really 1,300 troops for the entire continent that are not committed either to working in some of the embassies.